I will start my intervention with some general information on the exercise, and I will then elaborate on how EIOPA is planning to work on insurers and IORPs. And then I will conclude with an overview of the scenarios prescribed for the sensitivity before passing the floor to Ivan that will elaborate more on them, on the scenario themselves. So let's start from setting a little bit the scene with some background. So under the European Green Deal presented on 11 December 2019, all the 27 EU member states committed to turning the European Union into the first climate neutral continent by 2025. And also pledged to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030. Unfortunately, any transition comes at a cost, and such an ambitious goal requires large investment. The European Commission, in its communication of the 6th of July 2021 on the strategy for financing the transition to a sustainable economy, estimated that the European Union will need some 350 billion euro in additional investment per year over this decade to meet the 2030 emission reduction target. And this amount is only limited to the energy system alone. This level of intervention cannot be covered by spending, by public spending only. Contribution to sustainable economic activities shall also come from the private sector. And the financial system needs to be in the position to put some skin in the game. The latter point, namely the condition under which the private financial flows can be channeled into sustainable economic activities, is exactly the concern of the sensitivity analysis at stake. So, what is the request and the purpose of this exercise? The European Commission, indeed following up on one of the initiatives contained in its communication on the strategy for financing the transition to a sustainable economy, invited the European supervisory authorities, so the European Banking Authorities, European Security and Market Authority, the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority, and the European Systemic Risk Board, as well the European Central Bank, to assess the impact of early climate risk-related shocks in form of transition risk or anticipation of increasing physical risks on the evaluation of the assets of the European financial system, i.e. banks, funds, insurers, and IORPs. The aim is to understand whether and to what extent the materialization of such a scenario could impair the EU financial system capacity to channel private investment into the real economy, also considering contagion and second round effect, and eventually jeopardizing the achievement of the EU emission reduction target by 2030. And here I would like to drive your attention to two main elements, basically. All the involved parties, so the ESAs and the ECB and the SRB, already ran quantitative and qualitative assessment in form of stress test or sensitivity analysis of climate-related risk on their sector of competence. EIOPA, for example, started in 2018, introducing a NatCat-based scenario in its EU-wide insurance stress test. Then in 2020, published the sensitivity analysis of climate change-related transition risks. And more recently, in 2022, we published a study on the European insurers' exposure to physical climate change risk. And we also ran the first EU-wide climate stress test for the occupational pension sector. So the innovation brought by this sensitivity analysis is that the scenarios shall be applied to all the financial sector. And the assessment, while limited to the impact on the asset, shall encompasses also elements of contagion and across the sector and second round effect. The results, as we summarized in a common report, expected not later than Q1 2022. 2025, and could be the results could be fed into subsequent supervisory monitoring programs of ESAs and the ECB, where the exercise identifies specific vulnerability in the financial system. Very well. So let's move now on how EIOPA is planning to approach this exercise. So the sectorial analysis we conducted by the three ESAs, EIBA, ESMA, and EIOPA, following two main principles. Let's say, the idea is to rely on sectorial models and primarily on data that are already available by the institutions. And the second pillar, let's say, is that we need to ensure consistency in the application of the shocks and the level playing field among the different sectors. And to ensure the latter, extensive coordination activities have been set and are in place and up and running. Scenarios are centrally designed by the ECB and the ESRB with shocks that are calibrated at the sector level. EIOPA is planning to apply, as for all the other sensitivity analysis and stress test, the set of instantaneous market shocks provided to the full sample of solo insurance undertakings and IORPs reporting under the Solvency II and IORP framework. The application of the shocks are planned to be done centrally, namely via top-down assessment to the 2022 year-end position of the entities involved in the exercise. And we are not envisaging specific data collection to the insurance industry or to the pension sector at this stage. But let's elaborate a little bit more on the scenarios. That is the part that is more, let's say, advanced in the design of this exercise. So to ensure that a robust, credible, and usable set of information can be inferred from the exercise, the scenarios and the shocks therein shall embed characteristics of severity, plausibility, and economic consistency. These characteristics shall be granted over a time horizon up to 2030. Provided that the climate-related shocks are not happening in isolation, but in the context of the overall economic, financial, and geopolitical development, the European Commission requested to simulate the materialization of the climate-related shocks under two projections. The first projection that we refer to as a baseline scenario assumes that the European economy evolves according to the expected condition, whereas the second scenario, called adverse scenario, assumes that the climate-related shocks materialize under a distressed market and economic condition. You can already understand that the challenge to fulfill this request is pretty high. Just to mention a few, I mean, generate economic and market projection for long time horizon is not a walk in the park, I would say. Just to give you some ideas. EIOPA always operate in its own stress test exercise with instantaneous and permanent shocks, whereas EBA works on 3 years projection. But here we are talking about a scenario that evolves up to 2030. Second point is that the model is the modeling, basically, because the modeling climate-related shocks, and to add that on top of the usual set of market and economic shocks, it's another element that required a lot of effort. But I think that even that has to concretely do this job is better placed than me to guide you through the design of the scenario and the main challenges encountered. So even I pass the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Just can you confirm you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, as Matteo mentioned already, and let me just get back to that issue once again. This is a Fit for 55 exercise, so the basic assumption is that the emission reduction will be reached. So this is this is not something that's been tested here. This is something that is taken as a basic assumption, hence the name. Also, as Matteo mentioned, there are three scenarios basically. One is baseline, and there are two adverse scenarios. The difference between the two baseline scenario is, between the baseline and the first adverse is the run-on-Brown procedure. This run-on-Brown procedure is a novelty of this exercise. This relates to, as we discussed, the behavior of the whole financial sector, the confidence it has in the transition, etc. So basically, this is the difference between baseline and first adverse. While the difference between first adverse and the second adverse is the adverse scenario in the short term that is featured into second adverse. So the second adverse scenario that will probably be looked at mostly, that will be interesting, of course, is the combination of adverse scenario in the short term regarding the macro financial variables and the run-on-Brown procedure in the medium term. Let me also just mention that with this exercise, the timing was a little bit specific, but luckily, as you might know, the NGFS published recently new scenarios, phase 4, which is included in this exercise. And also, you know, with every exercise, you try to reduce the scenario drift, try to include as much as, you know, new data developments. But of course, at one point, you have to start with the exercise. So it's always a compromise. Please continue. And one of the topic, as I mentioned, the novelty of this exercise is the run-on-Brown procedure, and that is the environment in which the financial sector is losing confidence in the transition of, especially of the brown companies. So this process makes a very clear diversification between companies that are brown, companies that are green, and companies that are somewhere in between. But of course, as I mentioned, all the companies are envisaged to go through this transition, hence the name Fit for 55. And this was the exercise that takes into account firm-specific characteristics. So let me go into a little bit more details. As you see on the left in this credit risk module, macro developments presented with real GDP growth and inflation, they already influence the performance of the companies. And of course, you have energy, and together with energy shocks, you have energy prices, energy expenses, which leads to lower profits. Emission reductions, they require more investments, which increases also the leverage, etc. But also on top of these macro and transitional developments, there are also this run-on-Brown procedure. As you can see, it has 3 steps. The run-on-Brown procedure influences bank profitability, and then of course bank profitability influences the PDs that are then fed into the balance sheets of the financial institutions. But this is only the credit risk module. One also very important module, and perhaps more interesting for today's presentation, is the market risk module. Most importantly, the development of share prices, the equity shocks as we call them, because the equity prices are then again fed into the performance of financial institutions. And indeed, this exercise also made it quite obvious that we do have to take into account the developments on firm level, but also not just in terms of leverage and PDs, but also in terms of their value, which created some additional, definitely food for thought, which I can elaborate a little bit later. Next, please. So to be more specific about run-on-Brown, this is the novelty of the exercise. As I mentioned on the previous slide, there are 3 steps in this procedure. It's not exercise, it's a procedure within the exercise. The first one is to determine the exogenous shock on firms' financial constraints. How much is a single firm exposed to the run-on-Brown procedure? Banks charging higher premium for brown industries, perhaps. There is a paper by ECB colleagues that connects financial constraints index and firm's performance. And this was used as one of the, let's say, transposing vehicle between financial condition index and firm performance. But then in the next step, what one needs to do is to translate firm's financial constraints to the profitability. And of course, for this, coefficients are calibrated on sector level. This is a very important step. And then only the third step allows you to measure the impact on credit risk and the market risk. What's important is that when able, and of course, when the data allows it to take into account for specific, let's say, brownness or transitional risk, there are emissions per company that are available. So of course, it is able to calculate, one is able to calculate firm-specific brownness or firm-specific exposure to transitional risk. And that, of course, influences how you will be affected with a run-on brown. Because if you're not brown at all, you will not be affected as a company from this procedure. Next, please.
That's the last one.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, thank you, Ivan. Before passing the floor to Pamela to moderate the discussion, I mean, if you can provide us with some ideas on what created the biggest headache, let's say, for you in modeling. For example, you mentioned the use of NGSS 4 scenario that came at a very later stage, or for the importance in the novelty that have been introduced on the with this run-on brown, and how you tackle the application of this run-on brown and calibrated it using micro data, as you mentioned. You targeted individual company. So if you can give us some information on that, it would be great and useful, I think.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, with the run-on brown, the decision was made to respect firm-specific characteristics as much as possible. And of course, as I said, with every exercise of this kind, you do face some tough choices, right? But the decision was made because the specificity of this exercise is the run-on brown to some extent. The decision was made to try to respect the firm specificities as much as possible. For this, there are databases which can be utilized for this purpose. And as I mentioned, the work was already there in terms of connecting financial constraints index and financial constraints in general with the firm performance. Of course, you need this firm performance for later on, but how to get to that point, how to assume what kind of financial constraints might firm face. For that, considering the nature of the exercise, you need to connect it with firm-specific brownness. Now, we all know that different firms, different industries have different needs, different energy consumption profile, and of course, different emissions, which is quite normal. So to some extent, there is a sectoral effect of you as a firm, of your emissions as a firm, but to some extent, it does relate also to your profile as a firm. What is your efficiency? What is your business process, etc. So we tried to take this into account. Of course, when the run-on brown happens, it's happening across the board. So we assume that financial conditions index will be increased largely or maximum for the most brown firms, right? Which is in line with the exercise. And then from that point on, there are some models were already available, but some needed to be calibrated. And the paper that I mentioned was performed, let's be fair, 8 years ago. So there was a clear need to update the models, which is considering the firm-specific profile of the databases, which is actually quite a demanding task. But I would say that this run-on brown procedure, potentially rewarding in analytical and informative sense, really rewarding in that sense, but it did require a lot of work, and it did require a lot of consultations with ATC members and task force members, etc. I did went quickly through the other part of not necessarily run-on brown, but part that happens after the run-on brown, and that is the equity shocks. there were quite a lot of discussions what kind of model to use for equity shocks. Most popular Gordon's growth model is very simple. It calculates valuation, it doesn't calculate the prices. So it was a challenge what kind of approach to use for firm valuation. And of course, quantitative assessment is one thing, but in reality, prices are consensus among willing parties. So we also invested a lot of time how to understand the process and finding the new prices. Gordon's model is quite fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but you do need growth assumption and you need cost of equity. So if you have cost of equity and growth assumption, then of course you can use growth model. But actually to get there, it's very challenging. I would like to say that this is my opinion that firm owners, investors, if you like, are often sidelined stakeholders in the process, and sometimes their decisions are taken as granted. But when you think about it, they are actually the turning wheel within the process, right? Because they do influence firms, how firms behave, what kind of investments firms undertake. They are in the driving seat, so to say. So it makes sense not only for this exercise, but really to include firm owners and their behavior and look at the things from their perspective as potentially also very rewarding aspect of things.
Thank you, Ivan. That was very clear. So I think, Pamela, we can stop here and pass the floor to you in case there are questions from the audience.
Yes, Matteo. I mean, on this very technical topic, and what we have received as a question, indeed, usually also there are some recommendations after stress testing or some, but considering, as you said, there are so many projections that have to be made on such a long term. And what we always see as a question, and here we have the industry asking, what type of actionable measures could arise from such a scenario analysis? So this is actually maybe not a question that we can immediately answer, but maybe you could answer two things. Is it the expectation that the ESAs and the ESRB would also recommend some actions, or what would be the follow-up? And then the second thing is, how actionable can these results be from such an exercise? I hope it's a fair question, but I had to give it to you.
It's a fair question, not an easy one, I would say. No, the exercise is indeed explorative, is mandated by the Commission. So the idea is to have an assessment and then to provide by first quarter of 2025 these results to the Commission via report, both covering sectorial aspect, but also let's say the full the impact on the overall financial sector, and then discussion at obviously at Commission level that will involve also the ESAs and the ECB will start, and then potential follow-up or recommendation will be agreed and concerted among all these players. So, like Pamela, you said, it's a little bit premature to start thinking about some concrete actions or recommendations stemming from this exercise.
Thank you. Ivan, would you like to add something to that? Because otherwise I've received another question also on the scenarios, but please go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Yes, I agree with Matteo, and I would just like to say that, apart from some very direct benefits from exercise like this one, there are also some indirect benefits. And that is that you do increase the transparency, you do collaborate with other even financial intermediaries. They're also able to see final report to question some of the things, maybe to reassess some of their own model. So I guess every step in that direction, increased transparency and putting these topics on the map, so to say, gives some indirect benefits, but they also count.
Thank you, Ivan. Ivan, I cannot say if it's a fair question, the next one, but maybe you know more about it than me, probably. Would you have any comments about the GARIMA model for measuring transition risk? I don't know if this is a hidden advertisement for a certain model, but you can of course dismiss the question if you want. But
Karima or Arima, I haven't understood. Sorry.
I heard GARIMA, and I haven't been able to Google it sufficiently quickly. Maybe the submitter of the question. I'll wait for the submitter of the question maybe to clarify this. But otherwise, I had a very rather general question from the audience. So, what are the main facts or the main science or the main evidence behind the scenarios, actually, to make it a bit more telling, maybe also to a non-expert audience? So what are the scenarios that you're considering up to 2030? So you said that the assumption was that in the emission reductions will be reached, but what kind of assumptions lay behind that? Can you explore a bit on that?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for both questions. I will answer the first one also. I mean, the fact that there are some new models, there are some new ideas, kind of goes hand in hand with what I said. There are also these indirect benefits. Transitional risk is there, it's somewhere, it's not that easy to quantify, but I do believe that the investors are aware of the firm's profile. And if you become investor or you consider being an investor in a company, you will look at the firm's risk profile, including potentially their transitional risk. So one of the ideas and one of the benefits of the exercise is to start thinking also in that sense. This is one of these indirect benefits. Whether transition risk is included in a firm-specific beta, or is it one specific add-on in their total required return or cost of equity, that is something that indeed deserves perhaps a special event, a special seeing too. Regarding the scenarios, I did mention that it's the NGFS phase 4 scenarios for the middle term and for the all for all the climate variables and macro variables in the long term. Choosing the scenario was and generally is indeed a demanding process, because it needs to be coherent in the macro sense, but also, as we explained, also in the micro aspect in this exercise. So the micro and macro both make sense. So from the general idea, yes, you do need to increase emissions for 55%, but it has to be fitted in one very coherent environment. And this is why you collaborate with colleagues who specialize in scenario building, right? And then the experience from some previous stress tests features into this exercise. So some of published, some of the climate models are already performed and published. Some of them had to be modified, as I explained, with the random Brown combination of micro and macro. And I would say that the basic thing is, the most important thing is to have consistency, macro consistency, but also micro consistency, because you do need to include energy prices, from energy emissions to energy prices to energy expenditures on the firm level. You do need to connect it with investment needs, as Matteo mentioned. So there is more than one aspect of it, and to actually combine those would mean that you have a solid scenario.
I think this is one of the hugely complex exercises that is going on in the European financial sector today. And I thank you, Ivan and Matteo, very much. There was one final question, but I think you've almost addressed it. The question was, will the shocks and scenarios per NACE sector be made publicly available for the other institutions or market participants to also stress their portfolios? How granular will we be on the disclosure of the shocks and the scenarios?
On that, Pamela, I can take it. I mean, the scenarios have been finalized in the last ESRB General Board meeting, and the detailed scenario will be included in the final report to the European Commission together with the results. In terms of granularity, indeed, the shocks for some specific markets will be provided where applicable by NACE code, so by sector.
Excellent, and spot on time. Matteo, Ivan, thank you so much for this presentation, and good luck with the exercise. We'll see you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you. And as we can already see on the screen, we're moving to the next session, and I'm inviting Mark Reinke, the head of the DNB Sustainable Finance Office, to the floor. And he's also the co-chair of the NGFS Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Risks. And it's in this capacity that I've invited Mark. And he will not make a presentation, but we will try to liven up also a bit the afternoon, which is sometimes difficult. So I will be asking a few questions to Mark. But first, Mark, would you like to say hello and introduce us, make us an opening statement? Oh, we can't hear you. That's a good test. Yes? Yes, now it's better.
Oof, fortunately. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. You set the bar immediately very high, Pamela, because it also needs to liven up the afternoon. But I'm going to try my best. No, I'm happy to be here. I think nature-related risk is a very emerging topic among sustainability topics that I am very passionate about in my capacity as NGFS co-chair of the task force, as well as head of DNB Sustainable Finance Office. So I look forward to our conversation in the next half hour.
Me too, Mark. And of course, all the audience, the members of the audience can also submit Q&As. We receive the Q&As and we translate them to the panel or to the speakers. Mark, just as a first question, I mean, we speak a lot about nature. I love nature. I go and walk in the woods. But when one starts thinking of the value of nature beyond emotional and personal, physical well-being, what is really how do you quantify the value of nature in a financial terms? Or how do you quantify, maybe on the opposite, what is easier for you, the loss of nature? So how do we value this as a financial asset, or how do we take it into account in our financial decisions?
Yeah, no, of course, that's a fundamental question. So let me kick off by just repeating maybe after you that nature is fundamental to our well-being and to a healthy planet, to economic prosperity. I think we sometimes tend to forget to realize that without nature, we stand the risk to lose a whole range of things, ranging from food, medicine, energy, clean air, water, security from natural disasters, recreation, cultural inspiration. I only name a few. But the degradation of nature, as well as actions aimed at preserving and restoring it, will affect our economies and financial systems. I just want to share a couple of data points of recent research in the last couple of years. So research at my own organization, the Dutch Central Bank, from 2020 showed that the Dutch financial sector had a worldwide exposure of 510 billion euros to companies with a high or very high dependency on one or more ecosystem services, which was equal to about 36% of the portfolio that was examined. Second, recent ECB research shows that almost 75% of corporate bank loans in the euro area are granted to corporations that are highly dependent on at least one direct contribution from an ecosystem. And finally, work performed in your own organization, Pamela, at EIOPA demonstrated in its financial stability review of 2023 that almost 30% of a 2.3 trillion euro large insurer's investment portfolio in corporate bonds and equity are in economic activities that have a high dependency on at least one ecosystem services. So the risks from nature degradation are macroeconomic, macroprudential, and microprudential in nature. That's why the NGFS has created the task force that I co-chair to analyze nature-related financial risks, to help mainstream the consideration of the nature-related financial risks in its normal practices. Last September, we published a framework to actually understand the dynamics at play and to really understand the transmission that you're also asking for. And this framework aims at first to help central banks and supervisors to consider the relevant elements of nature-related financial risks and to develop policies and actions in respect of it. I would actually argue that the relevance goes beyond the central banking and supervisory community. It could help the entire financial ecosystem to better understand this transmission. It's a bit beyond the scope of this conversation, I think, to go into detail about the framework, but maybe let me be brief and say something about it. It shows, I think, how degradation of nature can lead to physical and transition risks, which in turn can have micro and macroeconomic effects. which in turn can have create financial risks that can be understood actually along the lines of the traditional risk categories, such as strategic risk, credit risks, op risk, underwriting risks, etc. So yes, nature degradation has an effect on the economy and on our societies. And I hope I make clear why the central banking and supervisory community considers nature-related risks. And now I'm going to borrow from Klaas Knot, who is the president here at DNB, squarely within its mandate. Or to speak with ECB board member Frank Elderson earlier this year, destroy nature and you destroy the economy. So yes, I think it has economic and financial consequences if we degrade nature any further.
Thank you, Mark. This was a very clear opening. So indeed, as you say, through the exposure through sectors which actually rely on nature, for example, pharmaceutical companies, or companies that actually negatively impact on nature, on specific ecosystem biodiversity systems. So that is what you call transmission, indeed. So there we are. So there is a value of nature which is transmitted on the balance sheets of companies just by the fact that these companies which they're investing in, or the risks that they're underwriting, we'll come to insurance later, actually have an impact on nature. Now, maybe going then a bit back and forth, maybe, but then, okay, how do we come to this prise de conscience, this fact that we realize it? What type of regulatory initiatives have brought this actually on the forefront in Europe, or what are the regulatory objectives then to try to tackle these nature-related risks?
Yes, very good follow-up question, I think, and let me be clear up front. I don't have the illusion I can be exhaustive here, because there is a lot going on. But it might help to at least mention a couple of what I consider the most important pieces of regulatory initiatives, and I'll go from global to a bit more local and specific for insurers. So on a global level, I think I need to start with obviously mentioning the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted in 2022 during the COP15, which is the COP for biodiversity matters. And the larger objective of this framework, that's also been called the Paris Treaty for Nature, is to live in harmony by 2050. And the framework has north of 25 targets, of which the majority are set for the year 2030, of which I think the most well-known one might be the 30 by 30 target, meaning that we should have the aim to have 30% of the Earth's land and ocean mass as protected by 2030. Another one on a global level that I think is important in my view, but potentially slightly lesser known, is the UN High Seas Treaty of September this year, which makes binding agreements on protection of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdictions. And these global agreements are obviously pivotal because their power cannot be underestimated. At the same time, they need to be translated into regional and national targets. So as the Paris Agreement led to national determined contributions, Kunming Montreal will need to lead to the establishment of so-called national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And it's important that these plans are concrete, granular, and actionable. Transition plans and paths are pivotal here, ensuring the future is pulled forward as much as possible, so to say. Now, on a European level, we see legislation and regulation coming up. And again, it's beyond the scope and the timing of this conversation to be entirely exhaustive. But again, a couple of examples. First of all, as part of the European Green Deal, there's the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 that sets out a plan for European biodiversity recovery by 2030. And following from this, examples of regulation would include the Nature Restoration Law, the Deforestation Regulation, and the Pesticide Reduction Regulation. Now, finally, let me turn to the financial sector more specifically. We see a lot of emphasis at the moment on transparency through disclosures. So examples of that include the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Activities. And also worthwhile mentioning is here that the International Sustainability Standards Board, in its last consultation, mentioned biodiversity as a potential priority for the next years, which is also, by the way, in line with one of the targets of the Kunming framework. Now, initiatives that may also deserve somewhat attention and praise in this regard that do not come from policymakers are, for instance, the work that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures has done, or the advancement of the topic through private initiatives like the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. At the same time, I must remark this is not formal legislation, which is something we should be moving towards to really ground this work. Let me wrap up with some words about insurers. I'll make it short, but the Solvency II framework also includes the prudential treatment of sustainability risks, requiring the integration of sustainability risks in the risk management and governance of reinsurance undertakers. And sustainability risks will need to be reflected in the investment and underwriting strategies of insurers and be monitored by the risk management as well as the actuarial function. As part of the prudent person principle, insurance will also need to take into account the potential long-term impact of their investment strategy and decisions on sustainability factors. However, further steps need to be taken also there. EIOPA has welcomed additional mandates proposed by the trialogue as part of the ongoing Solvency II review and has stressed that given the evolving nature of sustainability risks, Solvency II needs to continue to evolve to ensure that future sustainability risk challenges are appropriately captured. This explicitly includes attention for broader nature-related risks, such as biodiversity-related risks. So all in all, and now I'm going to really wrap up, I think there's a lot of guiding regulation and legislation, which is really also needed to root ESG risk management in a judicial base. Now, key for the near future, in my opinion, is to ensure that international fragmentation on legislation is diminished, meaning there's convergence between pieces of regulation and legislation. And there's an efficient, intuitive cascading roll-up from local to international legislation.
Thank you, Mark. And you have been quite exhaustive, actually. You even mentioned the Solvency II and the fact that next year, indeed, EIOPA will very likely, I think Solvency II is moving forward, will also ask the industry and the supervisors whether actually biodiversity risks are being taken into account in their own risk and solvency assessment. And this is quite a challenge again, where we were on climate a few years ago. Well, there we are on biodiversity today. And I see the deadlines are quite the same, 2030, 2050. So I think we'll have to be pragmatic also. And I think we should also maybe mention the taxonomy that includes now also nature-related risks. But it's still difficult. And let's then try to drill down a bit and to see how we can move forward pragmatically. So you got to Solvency II, now we're at the insurers. And EIOPA published a short staff paper earlier this year, where we try to identify indeed how could insurers be exposed to these risks, physical risks, transition risks, by being exposed to certain sectors or through certain products that they have, because there are also certain lines of business, for example. So could you maybe explain a little bit, how do you see, in order to move on pragmatically, what type of biodiversity risks insurers, and which type of insurers, which line of business, could they be most exposed to? And then how to measure these risks, also pragmatically, because we know we need a lot of scenarios, and what are maybe relevant mitigating measures. So first of all, let's try to drill down and see the heat map for the insurers, to make it useful also to do a risk analysis.
Yeah, so I translate your question a little bit, like where, what lines of business, where is this most relevant for insurers wise? And I'm going to start with a disclaimer in answering that question, because I must admit that I think, especially when it comes to nature-related risks, that's not the most easy question to answer in a generic way, because one of the specific complicating aspects, I think, of nature-related risks versus climate risks are that they are very location-specific and dependent on location-specific aspects like substitutability. So where we feel relatively comfortable comparing emissions of CO2 in different parts of the world, this does not hold for, say, the loss of a hectare of forest or the loss of a certain amount of fresh water. So my generic and slightly circumventing answer, I suppose, would be that you need a granular understanding of local circumstances in order to be able to determine where where the impact could be largest. However, I can say a couple of general things about it, which is obviously that it holds that where insured goods or activities suffer nature-related damage, insurers might face increasing numbers and amounts of claims. And again, just thinking along, this could potentially be for, proper and business interruption due to natural catastrophe losses impacted by the absence of nature-based prevention measures. Could be for something like the marine, aviation, and transport insurance due to, nature-related erosion, reducing waterway navigability, causing sinkholes and infrastructure damage, leading to loss of revenues. Could be in crop insurance due to loss of revenues because of reduced soil productivity. Could be in life and health insurance, increases in morbidity and mortality resulting from limited availability or absence of nature-based solutions for pharmaceutical products due to depletion of raw materials. But again, local specificities matter, and other sectors and other lines of the insurance business can surely also be impacted severely, I think. So that would be a bit of thoughts I had on the lines of business. I think you asked something around data and the tools to measure. Is that right?
Indeed. I mean, it's already difficult enough, and I think there's work to do because we can't again ask the industry to say, please measure your biodiversity risks, but we also have to try to better understand. And I see already in the chat, I mean, already relaying a question, which you don't see, but I see them. I mean, please define nature. What is nature-related risk? And I think I will guide the person who has asked the question also to our paper, the EIOPA paper. We define it consistently also with the NGFS paper.
Right.
Indeed, I started with an emotional and a symbolic meaning, but there is a value, there is a financial value to it. And indeed, but it's complex.
Yes.
But so it's difficult enough, but what would be tools to measure? And then indeed, you're working with the NGFS on scenarios.
That's right.
So how is that progressing? What are then the tools to measure the risk?
Yeah, and I think the person who asked the question has a very fundamental and good question at hand, and I think that the debate is also is in a way also still evolving around giving the appropriate answer to that question. But as you also say, EIOPA, the NGFS, other organizations are more and more able to give meaningful definitions to build on that also surround stuff like ecosystems and ecosystem services. There is some data available to actually start measuring. So, I think to identify and quantify your nature-related risks, and now I also borrow from work that EIOPA has done, but I see two big main alleys. And first is something of a mapping of the dependency of an economic activity on nature. And by doing that, the outcome of that would be to really understand how exposed an institution can be to economic activities that have a high dependency on nature or ecosystem services. And I already mentioned it in a couple of data points at the beginning, but obviously the reasoning behind here is that with further nature degradation, the potential exposure to those risks of actual physical nature degradation would increase. So that's, I think, one important alley. The second one is to understand the actual impact that an economic activity has on nature. Right? So not so much a dependency on nature, but the impact that an economic activity has on nature. And by better understanding that, we can also get a bit of a better sense of where transition policies in the future might come from, which is also obviously one of the sources of risk. So you have the physical risk category of actual disasters or a degradation of soil or loss of fresh water provision, but there's also obviously the policies that are aimed to prevent that might cause a risk and that might interfere with economic activity. And I think that if we have that, if we can do that in a structured way, and there are more and more ways coming forward on how to do it, we get at least a good sense of the materiality assessment. Now, that's part of, I think, part of the answer to the question that you asked. I think you also asked to say something about scenarios, which is obviously also a hot topic, as it is for climate, it is for nature, and unfortunately, I must convey the message that for nature, this is also rather complex. Especially good quantitative nature scenarios are difficult to come by, and I think that message is highly actual, given that the NGFS yesterday came out with a large publication to that end, where it at least gave not so much it did not provide any nature scenarios yet, but it gave a lot of sort of tips for the advancement towards nature-related scenarios. So that could leave one rather unsatisfied by saying, it's difficult to do it in a quantitative way. We still need to cross multiple bridges before we're there. But I do think that we can start taking steps, both in a quantitative way, but also really in qualitative ways. And I think that if we start incorporating, for instance, something like the frameworks that are offered by the TNFD, we can move forward. And this would, entail exploring possible consequences of nature loss and climate change, the ways in which governments, markets, and societies might respond, and the implications of these on the that they bring for uncertainties to business strategies and financial plannings. And again, I'm not arguing here that we can get a quantified number that is specific enough to really completely rely on, but we should be able to get increasingly better sense of direction, and also by actually doing this work, we start to create the data that we need to advance it.
Yes, thanks a lot, Mark, because indeed you say a number could help, of course, but it's very difficult to get there. But what I see also with biodiversity is it's very difficult to see where do you start. As you mentioned, in climate, you can work on greenhouse gas emissions. There is a number there are maybe targets we see they're difficult to commit to, but this is something we got used to.
Yeah.
I mean, restoring 30% of what was it, soil? No, you mentioned
30 by 30.
The 30 by 30. I mean, it is very multifaceted. It is not, because it's all very much interlinked. Mm-hmm. It's that's why we call it also biodiversity. But at the same time, what we also see is this link with climate change. And some people may argue, well, let's tackle climate change, and with this, biodiversity will be helped, or the other way around. So I see there are very they can enhance each other, but they can also the mitigating measures on climate might also impede biodiversity restoration, or on the other hand. And then we're coming maybe to the expectations that supervisors could put to the industry to mitigate the risks, because that's what we are for. Yes. So once you start realizing that your industry, that the insurance sector, for example, is exposed through its investments to biodiversity risks, because the sector they're investing in are highly dependent on, or highly impacting on, or contributing to deforestation in the Amazon. Once you know that, then the question is, what are you going to do about it? And we've heard before in the other panels, and it's stewardship, it's engagement, but what type of engagement? And again, we want to be more concrete, more pragmatic. So in a certain line of business, you might also think of prevention measures, and there we come. So what type of measures are possible through investments or through the underwriting of certain risks to actually mitigate biodiversity risks? And one term that very often comes is nature-based solutions. Yeah. And what is this, Mark? What can we understand with that?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned a very important, and let me first say a couple words about that. The very important aspect of the debate ongoing around this is the what we call the nexus, right, between climate and nature, and that basically is something that says that the interdependencies between these two topics are so large that analyzing them in isolation is not a real good reflection of reality. So also the idea that we, for instance, could could solve the climate crisis before we go towards the nature crisis is something that I have sympathy for the thought, because it would make things easier. The problem is that reality doesn't allow us to do that. As you rightfully said, climate solutions have an impact on nature, and they are not always aligned. So not every positive climate solution actually has positive effects on nature, and the other way around as well. Not every nature solution has a positive effect on climate, or it can have, and that's where I'll come to nature-based solutions. But let me also once more underline, and I feel I need to do this. You already did it, but that as a supervisor, when I think of what we expect financial institutions to do, is to obviously have appropriate risk management. That's where it starts. That's also what our mandate allows us to do, and I think that's also where really significant steps are already taken. And so at DNB, just to give an example, we last year also published a guide with good practices on appropriate climate and environmental risk management, that covers, for instance, business model and strategy, governance, risk management, and information provision, and it's explicitly directed to insurers and also to pension funds, and we will continue on that path and start announcing on what our expectations are from institutions to actually have that sound risk management in place, a bit in line with what the ECB is doing with the banks it supervises. And again, there I need to stress that as a supervisor, and Frank Elderson also said something about this a month or so ago, we do not in the end decide who you lend or invest in. That's not our prerogative. But that being said, we obviously very much support insurers also in case they want to look for possibilities to create these nature-positive business models. And you said it, nature-based solutions. I looked for a definition by the European Commission here. It says like solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective, simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits, and help build resilience. And such solutions bring more and more diverse nature and natural features and processes into cities, landscapes, and seascapes through locally adapted, resource-efficient, and systemic interventions. End of the definition by the European Commission.
We want a concrete example, Mark.
Yeah, well, but you can think. I mean, a nature-based solution.
The wetlands, the coral reefs,
would be the restoration of wetlands.
Yes,
indeed. That thereby, that both serve as a carbon sink as well as a place for biodiversity to flourish and to grow. And the thing and the point that I finally wanted to make is that as much as we maybe are not as a supervisor the ones to tell investors where to direct their money to, I do believe that it's two sides of the same coin in terms of also really having a better risk management. So by actually thinking about what the future world might look like, or what it should look like, or what legislation tells us it should look like, and investing into that direction, I think we are also moving away from things that put us at risks in a sustainability-related manner. So in that way, I think nature-based solutions are a definite definite category to look into.
And also to address the nexus between climate and nature,
Absolutely.
maybe in some cases. Mark, we could go on for a while because it is a difficult topic, but then maybe let's come back to we're at EIOPA here, you're at DNB. And Paul Tang mentioned this morning, he thought the insurance industry might be the unlikely hero of the day because they're long-term investors and they protect society and pension funds as well. But I have the feeling, I told him, that I have the feeling that supervisors are being asked to be the unlikely heroes, because indeed, also as supervisors, we're being asked to help the companies identify their risks, and for that we also have to identify ourselves. What resources and capacity you at the DNB, for example, have you put into this, and how do you see your role as a supervisory authority on this?
Yeah. So I think maybe I think our role, we need to be careful to not overstep our mandate here. So our mandate as supervisor is to help and to ensure sound risk management, to define what risks are material to a financial institution and ensure they are appropriately managed. It is, in the end, the responsibility of policymakers, of elected officials, to decide on behalf of the people they represent what the world should move towards. But that being said, I do think that, especially as long as we can argue that moving into a certain direction could also very much be in line with increasing your risk management, we have a couple of degrees of freedom to also at least not have any barriers for long-term investments into these sort of impact categories. And that's also something that we are exploring. We're very careful and we're conscious on not overstepping our role and our mandate, but we also want to ensure that that where the sector sees barriers that are provided by the supervisors, we understand them well, and we try to move beyond them as long as they don't interfere with the sound risk management purpose that we have. So maybe that's where we are now. That's what we're putting our capacity towards. That's what we're doing when we're supervising here in our house, our banks and our insurance and our pension funds. And I think that's also an evolving debate that has not yet found a steady state.
Mark, I thank you very much, and we will stay in touch also with the colleagues from TNFD, OECD, NGFS, DNB, to further elaborate on this next year. So I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion. And I think also, sorry for the questions that we've received. There were a few more questions, but I think we have to move on, and we will get back on the topic in the near future.
Thanks very much for having me, and wishing you a very fruitful afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So our next topical session, which is the last topical session, unfortunately, for today, but a very interesting one to which we've been looking forward, will be presented by my colleague Marie. And Marie will be speaking to you as a senior expert on sustainability policy. And in this capacity, she leads the work on the CAT expert network at EIOPA, and she will be sharing with you what we're doing on natural catastrophe knowledge sharing. Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pamela. So I think I will share my screen, just a second. Pamela, can you confirm that you can see the slides properly?
Yes, and I will be off now from the screen, so you have more space.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to present you this topic around sharing knowledge and data to actually understand catastrophe risks. So let me start with the big picture. I think it's quite clear that sustainable finance is a priority for EIOPA. And there are also multiple, within sustainable finance, a lot of priorities for EIOPA to actually work on that topic. So I think the first one, which is very obvious, is really the need to manage sustainability risk. I think there is no big surprise with this one. And the second one is also the need to address protection gaps. So to also look at what is actually not insured. So this insurance protection gap, for example, for natural catastrophes. EIOPA is also working on sustainability reporting, fighting greenwashing. And the last part that I will really focus a lot on this presentation is really the need to actually share more knowledge and data. So this will be really at the core of my presentation today. So I hope I don't need to explain to anybody in this conference why it is actually crucial to understand catastrophe risk. This is important for supervisors, for the insurance sector, for the public sector, or for anybody in general. And in order to be able to understand catastrophe risk, we need to have access to adequate models and data. Models and data, they help you to do the risk assessment. They also help you to do prevention measures. You need to know what is the risk and what type of prevention measures and what is the impact of these prevention measures, and also to raise awareness to policyholders or to any citizen. So I will now start with the view from EIOPA. So from EIOPA's perspective, we have a number of work we are currently doing, which really need to really adequately understand the catastrophe risks. So let me start with a prudential view on the work we are currently doing on the recalibration of the Solvency II standard formula. So in the standard formula, we have catastrophe risk module, and we are currently reassessing the parameters, also thinking of the impact of climate change. So this exercise is extremely important that we have access to correct models and data to assess the risk. Then I mentioned protection gap. This is also where we have a lot of activities going on within EIOPA. And in order to understand the protection gap, we need to measure the risk. And to measure the risk, we need to have adequate models and data. Protection gap is important, and that's why EIOPA has also started to do a lot of initiatives to actually help to address protection gap. For example, we were looking from a consumer protection angle. We recently published a paper on the demand side. Why are people not taking natural catastrophe insurance coverage, for example? And something that came clear from this paper is the need to raise awareness on that type of risk. So also for that, you need models and data. And then I think from the previous presentation, we have heard also a stress test. I mean, EIOPA has conducted NatCat stress test and will continue also on climate change stress test. So also for that, we need an understanding of the catastrophe risk. Our initiatives around the impact underwriting, where we really recognize also the role of the insurance sector to help to adapt to climate change. And also for that, we need to have models that actually can reflect, for example, adaptation measures. And the last point I will just mention on this slide today is also the work where we, on the ORSA, so on the on risk and solvency assessment, where EIOPA has also published an opinion to actually add climate change scenarios in the ORSA. So also to do that type of exercise, it is needed to have access to data and models, and that can be also quite challenging. So I think I hope I could explain really also from our perspective the urgent need that we have to better understand this type of risk, and also what is required to get that understand. So, but nevertheless, I mean, we recognize also with all the work that we have been doing that there is a need to bridge knowledge and data gap. So there are catastrophe models out there. There are companies developing catastrophe models, also academics, and the supervisory committee need this type of data, knowledge, and models to do their task, as I mentioned in my previous slide. But really, these are two communities that need to come closer together. And we as EIOPA, we see a role here to be a bridge between the two communities. Of course, when doing that, there are a number of challenges. I mean, two communities might have different languages, so we need to also come closer and create a common vocabulary. We also need to create maybe common standards. And sometimes it is also the fact that catastrophe models could be perceived as black boxes. I mean, supervisors might not be experts in this field. So there is the need to have more knowledge sharing exchanges to improve their understanding. Of course, with that, we see as EIOPA a lot of opportunities, and that's also why we are doing it. Better understanding catastrophe risk also means better supervision and also more awareness. So these are the reasons why EIOPA is currently implementing a lot of activities to position itself as a center of excellence for catastrophe modeling and data. And with saying that, we have a number of ambitions. And I will now explain you a bit what are these ambitions that we have at EIOPA. So the first one, and I mentioned it already quite a few times in the other slide, is really the need to raise awareness on catastrophe risk. I think this is something we really identified that is key to really better understand and better know what is the risk. So how could we achieve that as EIOPA? I mean, we would like to organize public events on this topic. And we also are working toward tools to, for example, enhance risk awareness and the understanding of prevention measures. Second, being a European authority, what is very important for us is also to offer an EU-wide perspective to this topic. So we will collect EU-wide information and also provide advice at European level. In addition, of course, what is at core of what we want to do is really to facilitate knowledge sharing. I think it's very important. Sometimes catastrophe risk modeling can be perceived as something very specific, but it's really needed also for supervisors, also for the public sector. So we would like to really help there, and for example, to facilitate the knowledge sharing between supervisors and model providers. In addition, what we also have clearly realized is the need to have access to data. And also there, EIOPA wants to play a role to facilitate the access to more and better data. And I will say a bit more later in this presentation. And finally, to close our list of ambition is that we also clearly have identified the need to have more innovation. And I will also come to this topic a bit later in my slides by talking about the initiative we have around promoting open source models. So this is about our ambition and to position EIOPA as a center of excellence for catastrophe models and data. I mentioned before that, of course, we need to understand catastrophe risk for supervisory perspectives, but also what is very important for us is to help to address protection gap. And to address protection gap, I mean, at EIOPA, we have identified these 4 elements, if I may say so. So the first one really to address protection gap is the need to understand what is the risk and what is the protection gap. So for that, of course, we need to get access to models and data, and I will also say a few words about the dashboard that we have developed at EIOPA. Second element is really the need to think when addressing protection gap to mitigate the risk. And this will be really an important step even before thinking of increasing the insurance penetration. It is required to actually first think about mitigating the risk, taking prevention measures, adaptation measures. So for that, also, there is a need to have access to the right models and data to actually be able to measure the cost benefit of adaptation measures. Thirdly, of course, we are looking here at the insurance protection gap. We also need to look into insurance products. And I mentioned really this work that was done from EIOPA on the demand side, for example, looking why are people not taking insurance coverages, and really what came out is really the need to raise more awareness. So also with our initiative here, we would like to help to contribute to raising awareness of catastrophe risk to the general public. And the last point here on this slide is, of course, I mean, we have a significant protection gap in Europe, and we need to address it. We need to take measures together, and maybe this risk at some point is quite large, and there will be the need to have more and more public-private partnerships. And what will be very important with this public-private partnership is also to have a common understanding of the catastrophe risk, so to use common models and common data. So I mentioned I will just I have a few slides about concrete deliverable that EIOPA has done, really with regard to catastrophe risk, protection gap, and understanding the risk. So the first one is this dashboard. I mean, to understand the protection gap, we have just released an update. And I think when we developed this, initially this dashboard, what was really a challenge for us, I mean, we are covering 30 countries, we are looking at 5 different perils, is really to get access to the right input data to also have an adequate measure and monitoring of the protection gap. And this is really a challenge. And as EIOPA, we have committed to update it annually. And what we also hope is that, I mean, we get the input data from the national supervisors, that also with time that we can improve and learn from this exercise to really, with time, converge and have a better measure of the insurance protection gap. Then what we also have done as an initiative, and we had a public event earlier this year, is around open source models, to also promote the use of more open source models. And why? Well, I mentioned we have developed this dashboard on the protection gap, and what we quickly realized is, of course, that for countries where there is usually a small protection gap, it's also linked with high insurance penetration. There are usually quite a lot of data and a lot of models available. But we are also interested in improving the situation for countries where there is a high protection gap. So maybe in these countries there are less data and less models available. So for that type of countries, also looking into what is developed by academics or open source could also be helpful to complement the risk view and to do risk assessment analysis. So this was the reasons also why EIOPA started to look at the open source world and worked together with the ETH at Zurich University to actually build a user interface. So that was really a pilot that we did in that regard, really to have a first initial step into looking, okay, what does it mean to do a catastrophe risk analysis, and also to maybe help to better understand, okay, what are the input data that I need to perform such an analysis. Then I need to select my hazard. If I want to do forward-looking scenario, I need to choose the RCP, the time horizon, and so on. So we know this is a small step, but really to try to help to start doing that type of analysis. And of course, I mean, we talk a lot about measuring, monitoring the protection gap, modeling the catastrophe risk. But to do that, there is really the need to have access to data, because typically to build models, to calibrate models, you need to have access to data. And this has been already recognized by the European Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which clearly mentions the need for more and better data related to risk and to losses. So also there, EIOPA will partnership with the Commission to help to improve the situation. And finally, what I also wanted to mention today is, of course, the release of EIOPA's new catastrophe data hub. So what is that? We have collected in the past data, for example, for the insurance protection gap dashboard, or also for studies from financial stability perspective on the physical risk, or trying to assess the flood risk for the insurance sector. So what we wanted here with this dashboard is to facilitate the view of this data. And what we also hope is to be able in the future to complement this dashboard with new data. What we must say for the moment, this is not 100% market view, because it was based on a subset of companies, but we hope to be able to improve and continue to work on that catastrophe data hub. So for today, I will end my presentation by having two core messages. I think we have an increasing catastrophe risk. Increasing catastrophe risk because of different reasons. Climate change, also maybe the price of the economic exposure. All of these make that the catastrophe risk is currently increasing. Of course, what this also means is that we have a potential widening of an already existing large protection gap. And these are challenges that need to be addressed. And we have joined multiple conferences, listened to the various stakeholders. And I think what always came clear is the need to have more collaboration. So really this initiative EIOPA's initiative to establish itself as a center of excellence in catastrophe models and data is really an invitation for having more public and private exchanges. And second, my second message is really that also by listening to different stakeholders, what also is clear is that if we want to improve the supervision of catastrophe risk, if we want to help to address protection gap, there is also the need of more data sharing. And here I just mentioned our new catastrophe data hub, which is a step to facilitate the access to valuable data. I think that was for me, Pamela. So I think we could go to some questions.
Yes, Marie. And Marie, you remember we actually had a question for the audience and we wanted to ask it first before you started your presentation. But I think maybe it's good that the audience got some inspiration also. So we have a slide for the audience. Dear audience, please respond to the question that we're showing to you on screen. So go to slido.com, EIOPA Sustainable Finance Conference, the last time of the day where you can give your views. And you tap the code #EU Sustainable Finance. Now, probably it's like an open book exam, right? Marie has just given you lots of tools that we've prepared to improve the knowledge, but still you may think that something is missing. So you have the opportunity to put this on the screen while we are speaking, and I hope, more data, more models. Well, there we go, open book exam. But Marie, in the meanwhile, I've received a question. So and it's always about the next steps. It seems that it's never enough. It's never enough. So let's maybe recap. We have a dashboard. We have now a risk hub where we see the insured losses from different perils. People may still remember that we're also working on an EU-wide perspective to address catastrophe risks. So what do you think, Marie? Instead of asking what's next, I think it's a bit unfair. But what do you think? Data sharing, collaboration. But what would you like to see happening? What is actually the ultimate goal of sharing knowledge and data on catastrophe risks?
Yes, I think what I really would like to see happening is more exchange between what we call the private and the public sector. I think this is really something we have behind all this initiative, and I think that was also my call of the last message on my slide is also us as EIOPA, we can very well be a bridge also between the private sector that we know, and also with all this initiative happening at the European Commission, also at different government, where we can help to have common understanding of the problem, because I think that's also something that we need to mention. And EIOPA, we join different events, also in different countries where there are some public-private partnerships that are set in place. And there is really the need to have all actors together at the table to think about, data sharing, common modeling of the risk, and then also to see, what type of measures can be implemented together that can function for everyone together, as well as the private sector that has a key role to play when we talk about addressing protection gap, but also, of course, the government and the public sector.
And as you have shown, the supervisors have a great role in bridging that gap also by sharing the expertise, by having the knowledge, but also by preparing tools, by pulling it together and actually acting as a bridge. I think this is also something which is critical. And indeed, Marie, would it then be correct to say open source is essential to that, because then people have access to the same data and they can align actually the prevention measure, but that would be then the next step. We have the information, do we understand it? So there will be probably a lot of engagement. Aren't you engaging also a lot with the industry on collecting the data, but then also on seeing what would be potential measures? Because that was actually the question from the audience. What measures are we then taking based on that knowledge as a supervisory authority?
So which measures we are taking to
actually improve the management of these catastrophe risks?
Yes. So of course, I think it's quite clear that, first of all, EIOPA can help to collect that data. And what we also want is to be able to then share it also as open source, because I think that's very important that we have this possibility to also that the people that need this type of data can actually also get access and use it and have common data to compare. And I think that's really something that is quite important for us and from our perspective. And we also would like to then use this type of data from our perspective to do the calibration of the standard formula, or also to measure the protection gap, so that we can all use this data that can be accessible to multiple stakeholders, and then also do our own conclusions from an EIOPA perspective.
Thank you. Marie, one cheeky question, but I think we're up for it. Does this mean that EIOPA is going to develop its own models for catastrophe? Is that something, or are we in the market for validating? It's a bit cheeky. How do we open the box?
I mean, I don't think we are at that stage at all. I mean, that's developing a model is quite complex, and I think we have the chance to have very valuable and very good models around. So that I think we know, and that's extremely valuable. But nevertheless, what we think what is important is to have better understanding of these models, and that's really where we want to act, and allowing better understanding. Why? Because of course, I mean, catastrophe models on their own, they are already quite complex, but now we know with sustainable finance, with climate change, you add additional layer on these models that are already complex. So I think also for us as supervisors, but also for other people who need these type of models, it's important to allow discussions and to also understand, okay, what is the need of a supervisor, for example, or what is the need of a government to be able to model the risk, and to really allow that type of discussion and more exchange. I think that's really our
That's the
goal.
message.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, very clear. Marie, somebody picked up on the demand side aspects, and I think the person states that the main reason why consumers are not taking, and it's relating to the protection gap, and we know the main reason why consumers are not taking up insurance against Nat Cat is, and the winner is, weak trust. I'm just giving it to you. I'm not sure. We mentioned already, I think earlier today, that we will look into policy options on what are the main measures to take to also address the demand side. But indeed, financial literacy, maybe already the fact that consumers can see and can go to their insurance, say, look, I see there are a lot of insured losses, or the catastrophe gap is there. How is this affecting my coverage? So I think with all of this, as you say, better understanding, maybe not of the model for the consumer, but better risk awareness, right?
Yes, no, exactly. I think some initiative that we have in mind is indeed that, you know, if someone understands, okay, I have maybe a house somewhere, maybe it's next to a river, that they better understand, okay, what is the risk that my property is facing, then they can have also, and maybe also about potential prevention measures that would maybe need to be implemented. It's a different discussion you can have than if you, I mean, when you're going to go to your insurer and ask for insurance coverage, because you see, okay, that are my risks, this is a product that I need. So, and also that maybe by adding this topic on prevention measures, we know it's quite a challenging topic, but at least that it can be discussed, and also that the insurer can be seen as an advisor that help the policyholder to mitigate the risk and not just act when the claims already happened, and then there are discussions about, okay, when the claim is paid, but really proactively to have, and I think this could also help with the trust issue you mentioned, Pamela. That
yes. Yes, very, very right. So better understanding leads to better prevention, and better, indeed, alignment between maybe the of the insurers and the consumers. Now we can quickly have a look, Marie. I don't know if you can read it. Is it not too small on your screen? Funnily enough, this morning when we had a cloud where we asked what would be the main initiatives to reach actually sustainability goals by 2030, collaboration was also in the middle. I don't know if somebody really has very big interest, and I think we've shown also with your initiative that collaboration with the industry, with the public entities is key to collect the data, but then also to. But what would you pick out? There are a few ones which I wouldn't choose, but what comes to your mind there? Is there anything?
Yes, I mean, I think we see many times also the word data. I mean, I think that from our presentation, it's clear that we also as EIOPA see that as an important aspect that we would like to address and to help to improve the situation. Collaborations mentioned, of course, and yeah, pooling data. I mean, I think there will be more work. Pamela, you quickly mentioned it also that this collaboration we are doing with the ECB to look at. And there is more to come next year to look at exactly this need, okay, private sector, but also public sector, and pulling risk together, and also look at European potential solutions. So pooling risks together at European level. So I think these are all the words resonate somehow with some initiatives that are going on. Or
it's always about more data, Mary, more data, more data. I think you've done a great job already. And I see also workshops. I'm sure that we will engage further with the industry also. We have the GAT expert network. I always say it wrong, but there will also be opportunities to engage further. Mary, I think next year there will be.
Yes.
And,
yes, we are planning to have at least a public event also on that topic, indeed.
And then you can go a bit more into detail. Marie, on this, I think I'm just looking. Oh, yeah. Yeah, voilà, there you go again. What is EIOPA's role with regard to modeling cat risk? No, we will not do a model, dear audience, but please then join again next year when we will be discussing further. Marie, on this, I would like to thank you very much. And this also concludes the topical session, and actually it concludes the conference for today. Thank you very much, Marie.
Thank you.
And before dialing off, you are very welcome to listen to a few brief summary remarks. And first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers that participate today, but also the audience. And what I took as a note, we had an overview of a lot of activities today. And we started with EIOPA showing, proving, mentioning how we move from policy to practice, because we have until 2030, until 2050 as a society to transition. And that is what we want to contribute to. We've heard a lot about transition financing. So it's not just about financing the green, the ultra green, but it's also helping the society that is moving towards more sustainable practices to also finance that. We've heard it from the OECD. We've heard it also from Shigeru. We've also heard what the role of governance is, and this is always the enabling factor for sustainability changes, is to promote stewardship, to manage the risks, but also stakeholder value. We've heard stakeholder value today. But also not to forget, in a world where there's large institutional investments to be made, that these should also support small and medium enterprises. What I noted also was one contribution where Shigeru said, my emission is your emission. And I think this is something that clearly sets the stage for collaboration and for a shared resilience effort that we have along the public and the private authorities, but also across the world on a global level. We've heard today Paul Tang saying that the insurance industry and the pensions industry might be the unlikely heroes. Yes, we are sure that they have the very important role to play in ensuring long-term viability of our society through their products, through long-term investments, but also by underwriting risks, which will prevent further losses and damages. But I also have this small suspicion that some of you are thinking that the supervisors should play the unlikely heroes, as we've been given also a lot of scrutiny, and we will have also to see how our industry is actually preparing to face the transition risks, as Matteo and Even have shown that we are conducting this coordinated effort to have a scenario analysis on how the transition is performing, but also if the transition performs, how it affects actually our industry and how the industry will be affected by it, but also how it can contribute to the transition. Then we've also seen the panel on the sustainability disclosures, and we've heard that these have impacts. And I am a true believer of the power of sustainability disclosures, but how to make it reliable and how to make it useful also for consumers. And we've heard a few suggestions, and we'll be sure as part of the SFDR review that we will continue thinking of how to make it better and how to make it simpler or more useful. Then we've also discussed nature. It's the next frontier, but the next frontier is closer than we've ever been. It has the same deadlines, 2030, 2050, to reduce the impacts on biodiversity. And how can the financial sector also take on this challenge through its investments and its underwriting? And we have to be pragmatic there, but we also have to be efficient and make sure that we address the right risks to our industry, and by doing so also to the nature and the natural environment. Finally, we've heard about the catastrophe risk modeling and data initiatives that EIOPA are taking to increase the awareness, to increase the understanding in order to have better policy making in an aligned manner across public and private entities. Now, this was an overview, and now let's try to take our spaceship and try to take off from the Earth and try to have what one calls the overview effect. And this is an effect which normally astronauts have when they leave planet Earth and when they witness the Earth and the blueness of our planet. And this, as you can read in many of their actually witnesses of astronauts, this is what they call the overview effect. And I hope this conference has given you not just an overview, but also an overview effect which helps you shifting your understanding of the role of the financial sector, shifting the understanding of the role of supervisors, and also give you an incentive to adapt your behavior. Because if you look at it from afar, when you take a step back from all the regulatory initiatives, policy initiatives, data sharing initiatives that we have, if you take a step back, what should remain is that we have a duty to care, a duty of responsibility, all of us, in the areas that we're responsible for. Supervisors take their responsibility in a risk-based manner to support the industry, to adapt to sustainability risks, and in doing so, to also provide a more resilient society. And I hope with this overview effect, you will conclude the conference with me by thanking all the participants, by thanking all the speakers, and thanking you, the audience, for having participated. We will make all the presentations available on our website in the course of next week. The latest, you will also have the recording of this conference if you would like to listen to it again. Thank you very much for participating, and see you soon at any of our further events next year. Goodbye.